From a storm-tossed wooden deck in 1621 to the gilded parlors of America's political elite, the Delano family's saga is a masterclass in how power is won, polished, and protected. It begins with Philippe Delano, a Walloon pilgrim who stepped off the ship Fortune into Plymouth Colony, and ends for now with fortunes large enough to bankroll presidents. Warren Delano Jr. turned clipper ships and Chinese opium into the modern-day equivalent of billions, installing the Delanos among Boston's Brahmin aristocracy. Their wealth raised hospital walls and endowed charities, yet it also greased the wheels of corruption and stitched a tapestry of secrets that rivals the intrigues of the Mellons and Flaglers. 3 U.S. presidents, Ulysses S. Grant, Calvin Coolidge, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, trace chapters of their rise to Delano money and influence, while matriarch Sarah Delano quietly steered FDR's destiny from behind brocade curtains. Today we unlock the sealed archive, opium windfalls, hidden trusts, and family pacts that have shaped a century of American history. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and join the investigation into the untold secrets of the Delano Dynasty. From new money to old money, the sense of possibility and power, where wealth, influence, and ambition converge, perfectly captures the transformation of the Delano family from new money risk-takers into old money stalwarts. It's a story that weaves in maritime fortunes, marriages of convenience, philanthropic crusades, and lingering scandals, all set against the backdrop of a rapidly changing United States. In this narrative, you'll uncover the real estate expansions, the opium trade's moral ambiguities, and the calculated alliances that propelled the Delanos into the upper echelons of American high society. Scholars and journalists alike, from the New York Times to historians writing in major academic journals, have drawn parallels between the Delano's trajectory and that of other well-known families who bridge the gap between new and old money. Yet this story has its unique aspects: a marriage into the Roosevelt line, charitable hospitals, enormous land acquisitions, and a legacy both lauded for its generosity and tarnished by its origins in controversial commerce. By the end, you may feel a mix of admiration for their entrepreneurial spirit and concern for how their fortune came to be, echoing the complexity that often surrounds families who molded the Gilded Age and beyond. Before the Delanos had old money gravitas, they established themselves much like any other enterprising clan seeking a foothold in America's evolving economy. Historical references, including a variety of academic and genealogical resources found on Google Books and in old newspaper archives, frequently cite how Philippe Delano, whose name was later anglicized to Delano, arrived in the New World during the early colonial period. According to genealogical records preserved by the Massachusetts Historical Society, Philippe's lineage linked back to French Huguenots, and he found prosperity through land deals and maritime pursuits. This foundation of shipping ventures and land speculation is reminiscent of what families like the Cabots, frequently cited in textbooks about early American commerce, were doing at the time. In those days, shipping demanded both courage and cunning. Vessels had to brave unpredictable storms, warring empires, and a global market that was, at best, a risky bet. But for those who succeeded, shipping brought enormous returns and laid a robust financial base that could catapult a family from ordinary merchants into powerful figures of influence. As the decades passed, the Delanos' strategic moves became increasingly sophisticated, shifting them away from the label of new money and closer to a status that resembled venerable European aristocracies. Maritime commerce continued to be vital to their ascension. Sources like the Smithsonian Magazine describe how families involved in shipping often expanded into overseas trade in tea, spices, and even the more dubious cargo of opium. In particular, Warren Delano Jr. emerged as a polarizing figure, noted for his role in Russell and Company's opium and tea trade. Russell and Company, at its height, competed with the might of institutions like Morgan's banking empire. While Morgan had a stranglehold on financial services, forging the backbone of an influential banking dynasty, Russell and Company capitalized on the lucrative and often controversial Asia trade. Historical essays and published diaries from the period show that Warren Delano Jr. spent many years in China, orchestrating deals that, while immensely profitable, drew scrutiny for their ethical implications. The opium trade in particular was fraught with controversy, culminating in conflicts like the First and Second Opium Wars, which shaped international relations and left a legacy of tension between Western powers and China. Articles in the Harvard Business Review have discussed how these high-reward, high-risk business strategies propelled certain families into positions of immense wealth, yet left them open to moral criticism. The Delanos were no exception. Confronting this issue was never straightforward. While other families, such as the Astors and Dohenis, engaged in similarly controversial businesses, John Jacob Astor famously dealt in fur and also had ties to the opium trade, and the Dohenis were later embroiled in oil-related scandals. The Delanos were particularly vocal about their philanthropic endeavors. Warren Delano Jr. may have participated in morally dubious commerce, but his relatives like Franklin Hughes Delano championed charitable causes. Franklin Hughes Delano used some of the family fortune to support the Laura Franklin Hospital, a philanthropic institution mentioned across various local historical archives. These charitable efforts were in line with what the Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie Endowment would later do, focusing on healthcare, education, and social welfare. Some late 19th century newspapers, available in digital form via the Library of Congress, praised such philanthropic work, depicting it as a sign of moral reckoning by wealthy elites. Others remained skeptical, pointing out that the money originally came from an enterprise that inflicted harm upon countless people in Asia. Either way, the philanthropic dimension gave the Delanos more social capital, aligning them with other philanthropic heavyweights and providing a buffer against accusations that they were merely profiteers. Another crucial aspect of their journey from new money to old money was the strategic forging of relationships through marriage, an age-old tactic used by European dynasties like the Medici, who united with royal houses to expand their influence. Sarah Delano, for instance, married James Roosevelt, fortifying the Delano-Roosevelt alliance. The Roosevelts themselves were already a prominent family whose history dated back to colonial times. By aligning with them, the Delanos cemented a connection to American high society that resonated far beyond the domain of maritime trade. This is akin to how the Medicis, once simple bankers, evolved into a family that intermarried with royals and commanded unparalleled power in Renaissance Europe. And just as the Medicis leveraged those connections to secure political positions, the Delano-Roosevelt link would eventually culminate in one of the most influential political figures in American history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Even though the text we have doesn't directly mention FDR's presidency, it's widely known from countless biographies and scholarly analyses that his maternal line came from the Delanos, and that background shaped aspects of his worldview, particularly his approach to wealth and social programs. Real estate played another significant role in solidifying this transition to old money. Ownership of grand estates was not just about having a place to call home. It was a tangible symbol of legacy and social standing. For the Delanos, properties like the Algonac Estate in Newburgh, New York, and the Delano Homestead in Fairhaven were emblematic of a generational grip on wealth and status. It's useful to draw parallels to the Cavendish family's famed Chatsworth House in England, which similarly stood as a testament to aristocratic heritage. While Algonac may not have been as sprawling and internationally renowned as Chatsworth, it was, within the American context, a marker of high society clout. If you rummage through old real estate records and local newspaper clippings, you'll find stories of lavish gatherings, philanthropic galas, and, occasionally, rumors of scandal or intrigue that made these estates focal points of social life. In the same era, families like the Vanderbilts built massive homes along the East Coast, including the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, and numerous mansions on New York's Fifth Avenue, further elevating the concept that real estate was the gateway to perceived aristocracy. Philanthropy was a logical extension of the Delanos' efforts to stabilize their social standing. Franklin Hughes Delano's Laura Franklin Hospital was one example, but there were also smaller philanthropic gestures, funding local churches, schools, and community centers. Some sources, including philanthropic records from the era, show that the Delanos participated in donation drives for public libraries or educational institutions, reflecting a desire to be viewed as benefactors rather than simply beneficiaries of a highly profitable trade. This behavior mirrored John D. Rockefeller's approach, who founded the University of Chicago and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University, to elevate his family's reputation. Later in history, philanthropic activities became almost a requirement for families of enormous wealth. In that sense, the Delanos were early adopters of this practice, setting a precedent that future generations would follow. Warren Delano Jr.'s opium trade profits. Warren Delano Jr., grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You see, Warren Delano Jr. was no simple merchant passing tea crates and silk bales across the ocean. He amassed a fortune through opium smuggling in China between 1833 and 1862, operating under the banner of Russell and Company. The twist in the tale is that this trade was not openly acknowledged as opium smuggling back in polite society. Instead, it was discreetly labeled as tea trade, and that deliberate mislabeling allowed Delano and his contemporaries to maintain a respectable Brahmin appearance in the eyes of their social circle. Now, before we plunge deeper into Delano's involvement and how it contributed to the Roosevelt lineage, it's worth stepping back and painting a broader picture of the era in which Delano operated. The 19th century was a time of tremendous economic and geopolitical upheaval. China, an empire that had long limited foreign trade to a few specific ports such as Canton, today's Guangzhou, found itself increasingly at odds with Western powers that were hungry for Chinese goods like tea, porcelain, and silk. Many Western nations, notably Britain, discovered that the Chinese were not as eager to buy Western manufactured goods, which made the flow of silver heavily one-sided. Silver poured out of European coffers and into China in exchange for tea, but it did not come back in equal measure. To correct this trade imbalance and ensure the outflow of silver did not completely drain British and other Western economies, Western merchants brought a new commodity to the Chinese market: opium. Although opium had long been used in China for medicinal purposes, the large-scale importation of opium by foreign merchants escalated the substance's recreational use, culminating in widespread addiction among the Chinese population. This created an immense demand for opium, and it was precisely this demand that offered staggering profits for companies like Russell and Company. But let's rewind just a bit and examine precisely who Russell and Company was, because that name doesn't typically pop up in everyday conversation. Russell and Company was one of the preeminent American trading houses in China during the 19th century, competing with British firms that had deep involvement in Chinese ports. Based on additional historical details found on Wikipedia entries and various scholarly articles, Russell and Company had roots that trace back to American merchants seeking to carve a niche in the lucrative Far East trade. The firm didn't limit itself strictly to opium. Indeed, it was involved in many facets of Chinese trade, including tea, silks, porcelains, and other goods exotic to Western consumers. But there is ample evidence that opium played a large part in the profit margins. According to multiple historical records, many of the biggest fortunes in the United States during this period had some tie to these early adventures in the Asia trade, particularly the opium trade. One might consider parallels with other families, like the Astors. John Jacob Astor famously dabbled in opium smuggling as well, though he is perhaps better known for his fur trading empire and real estate pursuits in Manhattan. Warren Delano Jr. emerged in this environment. Born in 1809, Delano belonged to a family that was already of some standing, but it was the move to China that became his defining venture. He worked his way up in Russell and Company, eventually overseeing significant trading operations out of Canton. At a time when the opium market in China was volatile because the Qing government had outlawed the trade and tensions with Western powers were rapidly escalating, Delano proved adept at navigating the murky waters between the official ban on opium and the relentless Western impetus to keep the trade alive. In one sense, Delano's role can be viewed through the lens of a pragmatic businessman adapting to the demands of a global market. On the other hand, from a moral or ethical standpoint, there's no escaping that selling opium in a place where the government deemed it illegal and that fueled widespread addiction certainly raises tough questions. And these questions are precisely why the entire endeavor was often cloaked in euphemisms like tea trade. As some historians have pointed out, including articles in the New York Times and scholarly blogs analyzing 19th century Sino-Western trade, these cover-ups served a dual purpose. They maintained a veneer of respectability among New England's elite families, sometimes called the Boston Brahmins, and protected them from the more heated moral debates about the ethics of profiting off of addictive substances. The Cabot family, for instance, also engaged in opium smuggling, and they too wrapped their operations in an aura of legitimate commerce, thus avoiding direct confrontation on the subject in their social circles. In Delano's case, the secrecy or partial secrecy surrounding his opium profits became even more significant in retrospect because of his familial connection to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States. While many Americans revere FDR for guiding the nation through the Great Depression with the New Deal and later through World War II, it is often surprising to learn that his maternal grandfather was once a participant in what many consider one of history's more ethically fraught undertakings. Now, if one were to dig into the Russell and Company ledgers, or any correspondence with important Chinese merchants of the period, such as Haokua, as suggested in the original references, one might find quite specific transactions that map out just how thoroughly opium permeated these commercial dealings. Haokua was among the richest and most influential Chinese merchants in Canton, and partnerships or negotiations with him would have been a significant advantage for foreigners seeking to expand their trade. This idea to investigate the Russell and Company ledgers or examine Haokua's correspondence has actually been echoed in historical forums and might well provide a treasure trove of data on how exactly Delano and his colleagues orchestrated their financial maneuvers. There's also an interesting parallel to be made here with John Jacob Astor, another titan of American wealth. Astor primarily earned his place in history as the founder of the Astor Dynasty, amassing a fortune in furs, then parlaying that into real estate in New York City. However, historians have noted that Astor once dipped his toe into the opium business, seeing it as just another avenue for substantial profit. The parallel between Astor's ventures and Delano's might help contextualize how widespread such dealings were amongst America's early wealthy classes. Moreover, the mention of Morgan's trade ties in the original text, likely a nod to the House of Morgan, opens another window into how various pillars of American finance might have, at some stage, built their fortunes on morally ambiguous or outright unethical enterprises in parts of the world they deemed frontiers. At a time when official British entities like the East India Company were systematically exporting opium from India to China, American merchants were far from innocent bystanders. They, too, capitalized on opportunities to expand their wealth, even if it meant defying both Chinese laws and moral standards that condemned profiting off addictive substances. Considering the question of how much of FDR's eventual political ascendancy was built upon the Delano opium windfall, one comes across a variety of perspectives. Roosevelt Dynasty was funded entirely, some might say solely, by these illicit gains. However, the critical note in the original text clarifies that while the opium trade's contribution to the Delano family's wealth is factual, the suggestion that it was the singular source of FDR's political or familial fortunes is exaggerated. Over the course of decades, families like the Delanos and Roosevelts diversified their assets, invested in multiple industries, and built up capital in more socially acceptable ways. Nevertheless, the notion that a portion of the capital that eventually helped the Roosevelts achieve their level of prominence can be traced back to the Chinese opium trade stands as a stark reminder of how deeply entwined global politics, commerce, and moral quandaries were and remain to this day. Columbus Delano's corruption scandal. There's another member of the Delano family tree who also got entangled in scandal, this time right at the heart of Washington, D.C. politics. Columbus Delano, the man who served as Ulysses S. Grant's Secretary of the Interior from 1870 to 1875. While Warren Delano's story took us across the world to 19th century Chinese ports, Columbus Delano's tale stayed a bit closer to home, playing out amid the intrigues of the Grant administration, the fervor for national parks like Yellowstone, and shady land grant deals that would force him to resign in disgrace. Now in popular memory, Grant's presidency is often remembered for a tangle of corruption charges. Names like the Whiskey Ring and Credit Mobilier pop up in many references to the period. But one of the less spotlighted episodes is the scandal involving land grant frauds that eventually toppled Columbus Delano from his cabinet position. The corruption allegations were serious enough that he had little choice but to step down. Naturally, when you have a powerful figure who happens to be a cousin of the president, you can imagine the sort of political maneuvering that might occur to keep the mess from exploding into a public spectacle. People sometimes compare it to Edward Doheny's Teapot Dome cover-up during the Harding administration in the early 1920s, which involved secret deals over oil reserves. But in the case of Columbus Delano, his close familial ties to President Grant may have helped keep many of the details from ever making front-page headlines back then. Even so, enough evidence survived in archives, newspapers, and letters from the period to confirm that Delano resigned under a cloud of corruption, much like the swirl of controversies that plagued many of his Gilded Age contemporaries. The Gilded Age, which spanned roughly from the end of the Civil War to the early 20th century, earned its name because it appeared all shiny and prosperous on the surface, yet had a core rife with corruption and social challenges. If you look at some of the big names associated with that era, folks like Jay Gould, who was embroiled in countless financial maneuvers, or Boss Tweed, infamous for Tammany Hall's political machinations in New York, you can see that Columbus Delano was hardly unique in his era. Plenty of politicians and businessmen dipped their hands in questionable deals. On the more international side, references in academic blogs and historical pieces occasionally parallel these American scandals to those in Europe, such as the Habsburg Empire's alleged electoral bribes or the hush-hush political deals that propped up certain aristocracies. The pattern of keeping corruption under wraps to maintain political power was a global phenomenon, not something limited to one country or another. In Delano's case, the fraud in question revolved around land grants, a vital resource in a young, rapidly expanding nation. If you think about it, the post-Civil War era in the United States was marked by massive shifts. Railroads snaked across new territories. Homesteaders pushed westward, and the government had to manage enormous tracts of public land. In 1872, Yellowstone National Park was established as the nation's first national park, a groundbreaking step in land protection and environmental awareness, at least by the standards of the time. Yet with any large-scale government program, especially one involving the distribution or management of public land, comes the potential for graft and insider deals. As Secretary of the Interior, Columbus Delano was in a prime position to influence who got what land, how certain contracts were granted, and whether large corporate interests got preferential treatment. Delano's downfall resulted from allegations that he manipulated or ignored certain rules to benefit friends, allies, or perhaps to line his own pockets. Though some details remain murky, historians generally agree that the charges were severe enough that he could no longer retain his cabinet post once they became public knowledge. One intriguing angle is the suggestion to examine grant administration records or investigate Yellowstone land deals more closely for specifics of how this fraud may have played out. Many historical experts believe that diaries, letters, and archived governmental documents might reveal patterns of questionable land allocations, perhaps sweetheart deals for railroad magnates or speculators who sidestepped regulations. Unfortunately, like so many political scandals of the 19th century, the paperwork isn't always straightforward, nor is it always well preserved. Some of it may have disappeared in the swirl of daily government operations, or it might be hidden away in private collections that have yet to be digitized. That said, we do have enough from newspapers of the time, some of which you can still dig up in specialized archives or even in digital form on Google Books, to know that Delano was pressured to resign and that this pressure originated from allegations of fraud. There's a fascinating parallel to be drawn here with the mention of Gould's Tweed collusion or the Habsburg electoral bribes as examples of how political figures have long orchestrated cover-ups to remain safe. Boss Tweed, for instance, controlled such a vast portion of New York politics that many newspapers lived in fear of retribution if they tried to expose him. In the case of Columbus Delano, his advantage was a family connection to President Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant was a Civil War hero revered by many, but as president he faced widespread criticism for surrounding himself with less than honest associates. Historians differ on whether Grant himself turned a blind eye, failed to understand what was happening, or was simply too trusting of friends and family. But either way, Grant was notoriously reluctant to believe that those close to him could be involved in wrongdoing. That set the stage for folks like Columbus Delano, who enjoyed a certain protective shield, thanks to family ties. The comparisons in the original text to Doheny's teapot dome cover-up underscore this phenomenon. Powerful people with connections can sometimes bury or minimize scandals. For the teapot dome scandal under President Harding, it wasn't so much about land grants as it was about oil leases on public land. Yet the overarching concept was the same: people at high levels of government manipulating the system for personal gain, then employing their political clout to muffle the outcry. In Delano's situation, the references point out that the cover-up is plausible but less documented. That means many historians believe something bigger was happening behind closed doors, but the paper trail either doesn't survive or never existed in a form that would prove an elaborate scheme. We do know the resignation is a fact. He left office in 1875. Newspapers at the time, including some that can still be found in library archives, indicate that Delano stepped down followed numerous outcries over how he handled the distribution of land grants. There's even speculation, fueled by certain local newspapers of the day, that unscrupulous brokers thrived under his watch, promising settlers land while funneling much of the profit into private pockets. However, we see fewer specifics than we'd like, which is why modern comparisons are often invoked. When we think of the Grant administration, we might conjure images of the whiskey ring or other big corruption stories that overshadowed Delano's scandal. Still, Delano's case remains a critical puzzle piece in understanding how widespread impropriety was during Grant's presidency. Sarah Delano's secret control over FDR. Have you ever heard the name Sarah Delano Roosevelt and wondered how one mother could wield so much influence over one of the most iconic presidents in American history? It's a fascinating story that often slips under the radar when people talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt's political legacy and his personal life with Eleanor Roosevelt. But let me tell you, Sarah Delano Roosevelt was no ordinary mother. According to multiple references, including material from the Roosevelts, it seems she dominated both FDR's personal and political life, carefully orchestrating events from his marriage to Eleanor Roosevelt to financial matters in Hyde Park. What's even more intriguing is that she did this while presenting herself to the public as a doting mother, someone who simply wanted the best for her child. Yet if you dig deeper, especially into comparisons with figures like Adelaide Frick and her hidden mental health secrecy, you start to sense a complex, layered pattern of control and manipulation that went well beyond everyday maternal guidance. Now, before we dive in, I want you to know this version of events isn't meant to disparage Sarah Delano Roosevelt unfairly. All the major points about her control are documented, but the extent of that manipulation is a subject of debate among historians. Still, there's no denying she had a hand, sometimes a heavy one, in shaping her son's life. So let's start at the beginning. Sarah Delano Roosevelt was born into the Delano family, known for their wealth and status, a background that provided her a powerful sense of entitlement and confidence. According to biographical sketches in the New York Times archives, Sarah's father, Warren Delano II, spent a significant portion of his life involved in trade, including international ventures that brought him both fortune and a global perspective. With such a background, Sarah learned early on how to navigate high society, handle financial affairs, and maintain a certain level of decorum. Some sources, including references from the Hyde Park Historical Society, also mention that her upbringing gave her a unique perspective on class and power, traits that would later manifest in her relationship with her son. By the time Sarah met and married James Roosevelt, Franklin's father, she was already accustomed to environments where she could exert influence. Several blog posts from historical enthusiasts online, citing diaries and letters, mention that James Roosevelt was somewhat older and had a more laid-back attitude than Sarah, allowing her a large degree of say in decisions. One might imagine that in a traditional marriage dynamic of the late 19th century, it could be more common for the husband to hold the reins. But Sarah Delano Roosevelt was different, often described as forward-thinking and headstrong. This is precisely where some parallels to Catherine de' Medici, renowned in 16th century France for her strong influence over her sons, who were kings, start to emerge. Though the historical context is wildly different, the idea of a strong matriarch shaping a prominent leader resonates in both stories. Now, Sarah's relationship with FDR began in what we might consider a typical mother-child dynamic for a wealthy family at the time: close, protective, and nurturing. But many historians, including those who've analyzed private letters and diaries, note that something else was going on. In fact, a handful of these letters reveal that as Franklin matured, his mother increasingly inserted herself into every facet of his life. According to the Roosevelts, a documentary series that delves into the personal histories of the family, Sarah not only encouraged, but also strategically planned out certain social encounters that might benefit Franklin's future. By the time FDR was a young man, she had already established a routine of guiding him, advising him, and occasionally demanding compliance with her views. The orchestration of Franklin's marriage to Eleanor is a critical example that underscores Sarah's power. While many might have the impression that Franklin and Eleanor's union was a straightforward love match, after all, they were distant cousins and shared a family lineage, there's evidence suggesting Sarah was highly involved in bringing them together, and bringing them together might be putting it mildly. Some accounts claim Sarah was the one who greenlit the match, made sure the timing was suitable, and even had opinions on the wedding arrangements, overshadowing the preferences of both Franklin and Eleanor. Another parallel can be found with Phoebe Hearst, mother of William Randolph Hearst, who was similarly described in newspapers of her time as a driving force behind her son's early career decisions and social alliances. Like Phoebe, Sarah seemed aware that a well-chosen spouse could bolster Franklin's social and political capital. But why would Sarah have orchestrated this marriage so meticulously? Some bloggers and amateur historians who study old family letters point out that Eleanor's lineage, she was Theodore Roosevelt's niece, carried substantial political weight. Aligning Franklin with someone from the Theodore Roosevelt family tree might have offered intangible benefits down the line, especially if Franklin himself had political aspirations. And as we know, those aspirations eventually led him to the White House. So in Sarah's view, this was simply prudent planning, ensuring the Roosevelt name and legacy remained strong within New York society and, by extension, the national political arena. However, the real drama unfolded after Franklin and Eleanor were wed. Sarah Delano Roosevelt was not the type of mother-in-law to stay discreetly in the background. Multiple references, including those in Eleanor Roosevelt's memoirs, reveal that Sarah had a say in the couple's household arrangements, including the famous dual residence setup in New York City, where Sarah's home was connected to Franklin and Eleanor's living quarters. Some references even say that the front doors were so close that Sarah could walk in unannounced, maintaining a pervasive presence that undoubtedly shaped the daily lives of the young couple. Eleanor Roosevelt, in her memoirs, often addresses the challenges she faced with her mother-in-law. While she remains measured and respectful in her tone, never outright vilifying Sarah, there are glimpses of tension and frustration that hint at how overbearing Sarah could be. In that sense, it was reminiscent of how Adelaide Frick's mental health issues were kept a secret in certain high society circles, There was always this veneer of politeness and normalcy, while a deeper, more tumultuous reality unfolded behind closed doors. As for Hyde Park finances, that's another area where Sarah's influence was particularly strong. Hyde Park, the Roosevelt family estate in upstate New York, was more than just a home. It was a symbol of status and a tangible asset to manage. Sarah took the reins of that estate, making sure that money was spent or saved according to her preferences. According to historians who have studied the estate's financial ledgers and property records, Sarah was not shy about giving her opinion or even overriding Franklin's decisions if she believed it was in the best interest of the family's image and long-term security. This parallels the type of matriarchal dominance we see in Catherine de' Medici's power plays, where controlling finances and alliances were tools to maintain authority. And let's talk about the manipulative side of Sarah Delano Roosevelt's personality. It might sound harsh to call her manipulative, especially since she was undeniably devoted to her son's success. But many accounts, including the Roosevelts, describe how she cloaked her maneuvering in the guise of maternal love. She might phrase suggestions as if they were simply wise guidance from a concerned mother, when in reality those suggestions carried the weight of an unspoken command. It's not unlike Catherine de' Medici's reputation for subtle intrigues, or Phoebe Hearst's quiet yet firm direction behind her son's empire building. The difference is that Sarah's sphere was largely limited to her son's personal and political life, rather than a broader national stage. Still, for anyone who's read thoroughly into the matter, you'll find there's some debate regarding just how extensive Sarah's manipulation was. On the one hand, you've got letters, memoir excerpts, and historical accounts that showcase her overbearing tendencies. On the other hand, you'll find historians and family friends who argue that Franklin had his own mind, his own ambitions, and was perfectly capable of making decisions independent of his mother. According to some papers archived at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, FDR displayed a certain level of respect for Sarah's opinions, but he didn't always bow to her will. Indeed, these documents show moments when Franklin would push back or chart his own course, particularly when it came to his rising political star in Albany and later Washington, D.C. But that debate, whether Sarah was the puppet master pulling all the strings or just an influential mother, rages on. Franklin Hughes Delano's affair rumors. Let's imagine stepping back into mid-19th century New York, a place of gas-lit streets, horse-drawn carriages, and grand mansions where glittering balls lit up the social calendar. In that world of ambitious families and delicate reputations, Franklin Hughes Delano found himself at the center of rumor-laden whispers. He was the husband of Laura Astor, a member of one of the most powerful families in the nation, and the talk suggested an affair with the wife of a European diplomat. It was exactly the kind of whisper that could upend social standing, destroy carefully cultivated ties, and destabilize the alliances that underpin New York high society. Unsurprisingly, both the Delanos and Astors had every reason to suppress it by any means possible, lest a single spark set off a blaze of scandal. We should note that the mid-19th century was still something of a transitional phase for New York society, which hadn't yet become the full-blown Gilded Age spectacle it would be after the Civil War. But many of the same dynamics were already in place. The Astor family, descended from John Jacob Astor, wielded immense wealth primarily from fur trading and real estate holdings, so much so that historians cite them as some of the earliest real estate barons in American history. By the 1850s, the Astors had also expanded their influence into banking and transportation, forging a fortress of money and power that granted them near monarchical status in Manhattan. Laura Astor, being part of that lineage, had her own inherited prestige, making her marriage to Franklin Hughes Delano a union of two noteworthy names. The Delanos, while not as famously wealthy as the Astors, were an old New England family. Their genealogical lines connected to notable figures. Warren Delano Jr. famously built a fortune in part through the China opium trade, and that same Warren Delano Jr. would one day become the maternal grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. With that in mind, imagine how any rumor touching on the family's propriety, especially one involving a possible affair, would be seen as catastrophic. In those days, social capital was as valuable, if not more so, than financial reserves. A single rumor could ostracize one from the upper echelons of society. Because marriage among the elite wasn't merely about romance, it was often a strategic alliance linking influential families, property holdings, and business opportunities. If Franklin Hughes Delano was truly involved with a European diplomat's wife, that might imply international ramifications as well. Diplomats, after all, represented foreign governments. A scandal involving such a liaison could drift across the Atlantic, where European aristocratic circles might seize upon it as fodder for mocking the new money of America. The Astors, perpetually mindful of how Europe viewed them, couldn't afford to have any member become an embarrassment on a global scale. What makes this narrative especially intriguing is how the entire affair was kept under tight wraps. Historians who dive into local newspaper archives or consult genealogical forums uncover only faint traces of the story, mostly in cryptic references to Mr. D, seen in the company of a foreign dignitary's lady, or hints from letters, where acquaintances talk about having heard troubling tales. Few mainstream sources from the period come right out and name Franklin Delano, possibly because of the family's extensive reach among editors. As was common practice in 19th century aristocratic circles, wealthy clans cultivated relationships with journalists, sometimes bankrolling a particular newspaper or offering exclusive tips on more benign stories in exchange for silence when it came to their own sensitive matters. Scholars comparing diaries of society women in that era note that many entries refer to hush-hush intrigues in language so veiled it's almost indecipherable to modern readers. Terms like "our mutual friend" or "his indiscretion with the Countess" show up, but seldom does the writer specify names. The Delanos and the Astors, therefore, had a finely honed toolkit for quelling an emerging scandal. If rumors floated around the parlors or at exclusive dinner parties, the heads of the families might have quietly signaled to other elites that it was best for everyone if the matter remained unspoken. After all, if scandal were to break open, it wouldn't just hurt the Delanos. It might also reflect poorly on the entire upper class, which prized social harmony and stability. According to a few genealogical records accessible in public libraries, some of which are also digitized on specialized historical websites, there were glimpses of sudden visits out of state, suspiciously timed tours of Europe for health reasons, or extended trips to one of the Astor country estates when controversy was brewing. In some instances, these abrupt moves were orchestrated to separate the alleged parties, or at least distract the gossip mill until it latched onto some other scintillating rumor. One must also consider the context of moral expectations. Although the 1850s were far from an era of unblemished puritanical values, especially behind closed doors, the public facade of respectability was paramount. Family alliances could hinge on the promise that one's name remained untarnished by scandal. Another dimension is that Laura Astor, as a woman of high social standing, carried significant weight in philanthropic circles, hosting or patronizing charities and social gatherings. An affair rumor implicating her husband might have jeopardized her position as a society matriarch. In the mid-19th century, it was often the wife who bore the brunt of social consequences if her husband was entangled in scandal. Gossip would inevitably swirl about whether she was lacking in some wifely duty or whether her family was cursed with immoral men. These rumored events took place at a time when the appetite for gossip was growing, thanks to the rise of periodicals like the New York Herald, the New York Tribune, or the Sun. Even in these early decades, editors understood that salacious tidbits about high society sold papers. Yet an editor could be swayed by an Astor lawyer or perhaps by a quiet business deal. Occasionally, newspapermen received tips or exclusive access to social events, guaranteeing a more positive spin on stories. Meanwhile, smaller scandal sheets or pamphlets sometimes tried to generate sales with sensational claims. But if they threatened to delve too deeply into a family like the Astors, they often found themselves outmaneuvered. It wasn't always a direct bribe. Sometimes the family would muster its network of business contacts, cutting off the pamphleteer from printing credit or distribution channels. Essentially, the elite utilized both carrots and sticks to manage their reputations. Travel accounts from European visitors to the United States in the 1850s, some of which are compiled in older academic journals, hint that Americans of means had a particular fascination with any whiff of aristocratic intrigue. The presence of a foreign diplomat's wife in the rumor added an extra layer of exotic scandal, tapping into American fantasies about European sophistication. At the same time, it highlighted a tension. The U.S. sought the cultural validation of European high society while also priding itself on Republican ideals. If Franklin Hughes Delano truly initiated or participated in a liaison, it could be seen either as a daring romance or an undignified breach of moral codes, depending on who was talking. That dual perception underscored how easily a rumor could balloon into a damaging fiasco, crossing national boundaries. Comparisons to other hush-hush stories from the same century are illuminating. William Randolph Hearst's rumored secret daughter and Henry Flagler's alleged love child exemplify how families with grand fortunes often dealt with similarly delicate matters. In Hearst's case, his media empire gave him direct control over what the public learned. For the Delano-Astor connection, they lacked the same top-to-bottom grip on media, but made up for it with personal ties and an unassailable place in New York's social circles. Meanwhile, Henry Flagler's enormous wealth, courtesy of Standard Oil, let him create layers of privacy around potential scandals, sometimes sending individuals out of state or overseas with generous stipends to prevent any public revelation. It might seem that in the 1850s, the American press was less intrusive than today's relentless tabloids. Yet within the small universe of New York society, speculation was no less intense. A single slip, a suggestive letter discovered, a carriage ride witnessed at an odd hour, could spark a wave of conversation. Husbands and wives in these upper tiers occasionally led essentially separate social lives, with the unspoken rule that any indiscretions remained discreet. The problem came when one such indiscretion threatened to cross the line into undeniable scandal. That's why, if a high-profile rumor arose, families sprang into action, closing ranks in an orchestrated campaign of denials and distractions. The Delanos and Astors likely employed every possible strategy, forging an appearance of marital bliss at public events, calling upon allies to vouch for Franklin's irreproachable conduct, and leaning on any acquaintances in the diplomatic community who might hush foreign talk before it reached American ears. Interestingly, historians trying to clarify Franklin Hughes Delano's actual involvement with the diplomat's wife have faced the same wall of vagueness that reporters in the 1850s might have encountered, while genealogical diaries or private letters sometimes include subtle hints like FHD, seen too often at Lady M's gatherings. They rarely state outright he had an affair. The language is coded, reflecting the era's aversion to explicitness. Meanwhile, official genealogical entries about the Delano family rarely dwell on personal scandals, focusing instead on birth dates, marriage alliances, and philanthropic achievements. Any reference to the rumored affair tends to be couched in phrases like controversy or unpleasant rumor, never defining the event in concrete detail. Consequently, piecing together the bigger picture relies on pattern recognition, seeing how frequently certain references crop up, how vehemently the families denied everything, and how swiftly they suppressed any mention in the press. The stronger the suppression, the more one suspects there was genuine substance behind the whispers. Much like the later Mercer affair cover-up involving Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where an alleged extramarital relationship was carefully managed to preserve political ambitions, this 1850s scandal revolved around preserving status. If the Astors had cut ties with Franklin Hughes Delano over such a rumor, it would have created a public rift, inviting even more speculation. Instead, the families apparently united, giving no outward sign of discord. It's an old social tactic. A wall of polite civility can muffle even the loudest insinuations. And so the rumor never reached a courtroom or public scandal sheets in a way that forced action. It stayed as half-acknowledged gossip, pervasive enough to disturb the family, but never so overt that it tore them apart. Amasa Delano's slave ship encounter cover-up. Picture yourself on the deck of a ship in the early 19th century. The sails are billowing in the breeze, the sea is churning beneath your feet, and there's a heavy, unsettling tension in the air, like a secret no one wants to name. That's what comes to mind when we hear the story of Amasa Delano, an American mariner whose adventures once captivated readers, eager for tales of high seas heroism and distant lands. In 1705, Delano published a memoir called A Narrative of Voyages and Travels, recounting his maritime exploits with flourish and detail. Yet there was a glaring omission in his narrative, one that involved boarding a Spanish slave ship named the Trial, and ultimately returning enslaved Africans to their so-called owners. Although many regarded Delano as a model of intrepid seafaring, this episode in his life points to a more complicated reality, one in which he appears to have played a direct role in supporting the transatlantic slave trade, even if he later chose to cloak or minimize the details. It's reminiscent of how powerful figures like William Randolph Hearst, at another point in history, concealed contentious aspects of their public images, in Hearst's case, rumored Nazi sympathies. For Amasa Delano, it was that day on the trial. What's fascinating about Amasa Delano isn't just this single hidden moment, but how the entire affair got lost, or deliberately buried to protect his reputation. Delano's memoir, which was published in 1805, was intended for broad audiences back home. Readers were hungry for swashbuckling tales of encounters on the open sea, tales that might include storms, pirates, mysterious islands, or dramatic rescues. Stories of forcibly boarding a vessel carrying enslaved people, then returning those individuals to captivity, didn't quite fit the heroic or romantic image that Delano, like many men of his time, might have wanted to project. After all, the early 19th century in the United States was a moment of moral and social contradictions. The new nation prided itself on values of freedom and liberty while simultaneously profiting from, or turning a blind eye to, slavery. Delano's choice to omit or sanitize the trial episode thus speaks to larger themes about how Americans of this period often navigated, and sometimes hid, the moral ambiguities of the rapidly changing world around them. Before diving into the specifics of the trial episode, it helps to know who Amasa Delano was. Hailing from Massachusetts, he lived during a time when New England had many mariners venturing across the globe, engaging in trade, whaling, or exploration. Delano wasn't just any sea captain. He was ambitious, curious, and keen on documenting his journeys. Delano's voyages took him to far-flung places, from the Pacific Islands to the coasts of Africa. His memoir brims with stories of unusual encounters, from interactions with indigenous populations to near-mythic storms on the high seas. Yet among all these recollections, the definitive account of his involvement with the trial is conspicuously missing. The trial itself was a Spanish slave ship, one of countless vessels in the transatlantic slave trade that forcibly transported Africans to the Americas. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Spain and other European powers still held significant sway over territories in the Caribbean and Latin America, where enslaved labor formed a cornerstone of the colonial economy. There is historical documentation, some of which can be pieced together from shipping records, logs, and partial references in maritime court cases, that shows Delano boarding the trial under circumstances that remain somewhat murky. The essential outline is clear. Delano, discovering the ship, intervened in a way that ended up sending the enslaved people back into captivity, effectively protecting the economic interests of those who viewed them as property. So why would Delano do such a thing? To understand that, one must consider the mindset of many 19th century mariners, who often came from regions that both opposed and profited from the slave economy in complex ways. Although states in the northeastern United States prided themselves on progressive ideals, they frequently engaged in maritime ventures that benefited from the broader network of slave trading. Some merchants financed voyages that carried goods to slaveholding colonies. Others built ships that facilitated the trade. Delano's involvement might well have been shaped by practical concerns, preserving alliances with Spanish authorities, avoiding conflict on foreign seas, or simply obeying the norms of maritime law at the time, which recognized the property claims of slaveholders. From a purely legal standpoint, stepping into the middle of a slave ship's operation could have entangled him in disputes he wasn't prepared to face. Or perhaps he believed he was acting lawfully. The crucial point, though, is that upon returning home, he had reasons to omit the entire fiasco from his memoir, aiming to maintain the public persona of a benevolent voyager. One of the tantalizing windows into Delano's role can be found in Herman Melville's novella Benito Cereno, first published in 1855. Scholars and literary critics have long recognized that Melville used Delano's experience aboard the trial as a loose inspiration. In Benito Cereno, an American sea captain named Amasa Delano, who shares the real captain's name, encounters a Spanish ship where enslaved Africans appear docile at first, but have actually taken control. As the plot unfolds, the American captain remains largely oblivious to the true power dynamics, a tension that leads to a dramatic climax. While Benito Cereno is a work of fiction, many see it as a pointed commentary on American complacency about slavery and the false illusions of paternalistic kindness. Melville was drawing from Delano's published narrative and from historical records to craft a tale that underscored the moral blindness of characters who prided themselves on decency, yet supported an inherently brutal system. Comparing Melville's text to Delano's own narrative reveals telling gaps, places where Delano's real-life memoir glosses over or simply does not mention the moral and physical violence tied to that fateful boarding of the trial. This kind of omission is not unlike other instances in history, where people in positions of power or influence chose to hide or distort uncomfortable truths. The original text mentions Hearst's attempts to disguise his Nazi sympathies. William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate, built a media empire that often shaped public opinion in the first half of the 20th century. Some historians, referencing articles from The Guardian and certain academic studies, point to editorial stances or personal correspondences that reveal Hearst's flirtation with fascist ideologies in the 1930s. Yet Hearst, through control of his newspapers, kept these sympathies under wraps, ensuring that many of his readers never questioned his patriotism. Similarly, Amasa Delano had power within his sphere, power over how to present himself in published work, and used that power to mold a heroic image, steering clear of the moral complexity involved in forcibly returning enslaved Africans to their subjugators. If we dig deeper, we see how Delano's whitewashing of events parallels other large-scale cover-ups or moral sanitizations in history. The original text invites comparisons such as the Cabot family's secrecy around the slave trade, which indeed resonates with the broader pattern of New England families who might have indirectly participated in or profited from the slave economy but rarely trumpeted this fact in official family histories. Documents that researchers have found in Massachusetts archives and genealogical records show that while many elite families publicly denounced slavery, some of them owned shares in ships or traded in goods that supported the slaveholding South or colonies in the Caribbean. Another suggested comparison from the original text is the Umayyads' Karbala cover-up. While that example comes from a very different cultural and historical context, the conflict within early Islamic history involving the Battle of Karbala, there's a thematic resonance. Those in power sometimes erase or diminish controversial or violent acts to preserve a more laudable public image. The entire cover-up angle is well captured by the phrase, "the captain who hid his slave trade." It's not that Amasa Delano was necessarily orchestrating a wide-reaching slave enterprise on par with major slave trading syndicates, but he effectively erased his role in a single defining incident that contradicted the heroic self-portrait he aimed to paint. Delano's illusions might have been partly for his readers, but they were also a way for him to maintain an internal sense of righteousness. Navigating the moral storms of that era wasn't simple. Many Americans would have been aware, on some level, that slavery was a moral wrong. Others, particularly in more abolitionist-leaning circles of the North, might have demanded some explanation or condemnation of Delano's involvement. Yet the easiest path for a public figure was often to say nothing at all, trusting that readers, hungry for adventure stories, would not press for details about complicated or ethically charged episodes.